Welcome back to the Winter Growers Podcast. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Niki Jabbour, who is an award-winning author, radio show host, educator, and gardening expert on year-round growing in a northern climate. Niki is located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Zone 5B at the 44th parallel, and she enthusiastically maintains half an acre of raised beds in her backyard. Using a combination of low tunnels, cold frames, and a small high tunnel, she grows over 30 veggie crops for winter harvest, including lettuce, scallions, parsley, carrots, leeks, and arugula. In addition to her books on year-round gardening, Niki also offers online courses on her website, savvygardening.com, and free educational videos on her YouTube channel and on Instagram. I love speaking with Niki, and I think she is an excellent resource for home gardeners and small-scale growers looking for tips and techniques for successful year-round vegetable production.
Today's episode of the Winter Growers Podcast is brought to you by RIMOL Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. RIMOL Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit RIMOLGreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a RIMOL tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. All right, enjoy the show.
Okay, so hi, Niki. Welcome to Season 4 of the Winter Growers Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. One of my very favorite topics.
Oh, well, good. Well, we have had a lot of requests from listeners about home scale, and you seem to be the authority on that. And with the techniques that you've developed for raised beds and, the home garden, I thought it would be a great conversation to have with you and learn the wealth of knowledge that you have and you've shared. You've had books, you had a radio show, you have this great website called savvygardening.com, online courses. There's so many great resources that you offer. And I think it's a wonderful conversation to have, to dig into all of those techniques and how you share all that information with people and how you've learned it.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, obviously, I've learned a lot through market gardeners who do amazing work. And that, of course, has informed and inspired a lot of the home gardening that I do.
Great. And you're located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So we've got the Canadian representing here. And I love, of course, I'm obsessed with parallels and, where everyone is located. And you are on the 44th parallel, which is exactly where Four Season Farm is. So
isn't that amazing?
Yes, it is.
I love that.
I know. Yeah. And I'm actually curious too, what you probably have very similar weather in the winter in Halifax, but what would you describe it as?
I think we probably, the past 10 years, obviously with the climate emergency, things are shifting dramatically. For example, yesterday, mid-February, we got snow for the second time this year, which is, very unusual, I would say. But I think because Nova Scotia is almost an island, we have, our weather is very dictated by the sea. So we're maybe a little bit more temperate, more rain, less snow. But normally winters are pretty white and I can count on a nice insulating blanket of snow, but that is definitely changing for sure in the past couple of years.
Yeah, no, that does sound like you probably do have a little bit less snow than we do, which is probably why you can get away with not having as many high tunnels.
Yeah, exactly. And plus, of course, I live in an urban lot. So there's only so much one can do in terms of space as well. And of course, depending where you live, there's often restrictions on certain types of structures deemed not as attractive, so I'm glad that's sort of going away now. But, a lot of people do have to keep that in mind when they're gardening in a home garden and trying to extend the seasons.
Yes, definitely. Well, before we get into specifically the layout of your property and all of that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and how you grew up, how you were inspired to garden.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the city in Halifax, like literally in the middle of the city. So, but even so, we had a little cottage near the ocean in Chester, Nova Scotia, about 45 minutes away from the city. And my parents, even though they were busy and had a lot of kids, they always made time to put in a little garden. So we always had a little vegetable garden. It was pretty weedy. It was pretty, not necessarily super productive. But when we harvested from that garden, it was the best tasting food. The yellow snap beans, the tomatoes, the cucumbers, the little bits of lettuce, the potatoes. It just tasted so good. And so probably by the time I was 11 or 12, I had taken over that space and started buying and ordering seeds every year. And then I got a grow light for like my 13th birthday. And I started growing things indoors, made so many mistakes. Like, of course, there was no internet back then. There was no YouTube. So I was just devouring gardening books and trying to learn from my mistakes and keep going forward. And eventually, I went to university, and my first degree is a degree in history, which is still a passion of mine. But then I studied horticulture and graduated with horticulture and, started working at a seed company. And, eventually I started writing, and writing was always a passion of mine. And it just kind of snowballed from there into newspaper column for, about 20 years and magazines, of course, at the same time, and then books. And I did 15 years in a radio show, just retiring last year. Mainly because I want my weekends back. And so I keep very busy with Savvy Gardening, my website, and of course, online courses. And I still do a lot of talks. So I juggle a lot of balls, but I have a lot of fun doing it. And every time I talk to a gardener, I learn something new. So getting out there and talking to gardeners is one of my favorite things.
That's so great. So your parents, did they just encourage you to do this when you sort of started to take it over? I'm always...
they were happy. I think they're like, great, go for it. You can do all the weeding. And oh my gosh, the weeds were incredible. It's actually a miracle. I actually ended up liking gardening, having to pull all those weeds and thin those carrots. But yeah, they were thrilled to get that off their plate.
That's so great. And then did you play around back then with any winter stuff, or did that come later?
Because it was a summer vegetable garden and we were only there July and August and then maybe some weekends in September, I didn't really have a chance to play around too much with season extension. I started to play, though, with different varieties, which is sort of the subject of my third book. I love to try different crops, international crops, things that aren't traditionally grown in Nova Scotia. And I remember probably the first funky vegetable I ever planted was lemon cucumbers. I got from a Canadian small little seed company, and the round cucumbers amazed everybody. I mean, looking back, we were so naive, but it was such fun, to try something totally different and unfamiliar. And so that really, I think, sparked my interest in different types of food. So I wasn't season extending at that point, but, at that point, I still thought vegetable gardening was sort of a May to September sort of endeavor. And you really couldn't go beyond those borders.
Yeah. And then when did you learn that you could do it, throughout the year, or what inspired you to try that?
Yeah, well, eventually I had my own house and my own garden. And I started immediately. The first thing we did after we bought the house was put in a small garden. I mean, it was about 10 by 20 feet. It was low raised beds. And I started growing everything. I would be planting lettuces out as early as I could. So normally growing up, I'd be planting lettuce in late May, but I started doing it like early April. And then I had been given a row cover and I covered with that. I realized that arugula, for example, one of our favorite vegetables, even after several hard frosts, it was still going strong in the garden. And it really kind of got the gears in my brain turning. It's like, well, if arugula can keep going, what else can keep going? And so in autumn, I would try lots of different types of crops. I read every book I could on vegetable gardening and season extension, and just experimented. Some things were incredible successes and some things were colossal failures. But, then I learned about variety selection and trying different varieties and how some are more cold tolerant than others. And I was much more, I think, focused and careful when I was ordering seeds, thinking, okay, well, this lettuce will be great for May, June, July, August. I'll pick some for heat tolerant lettuces. But then what am I going to pick that's going to be more cold tolerant? So I started to explore different varieties for everything from cabbage and broccoli and lettuce, to carrots to see just what would taste best in the different seasons. So, I mean, honestly, I kind of think of my backyard as a miniature experimental farm because yes, I'm always growing food for the family, stuff we love, but I've also always got a handful of experiments going on, testing varieties and things like this. Like my poor kids grew up, before they would pick anything, can I pick this? Can I eat this? Is this okay? Just not knowing for sure whether it was an experiment or just part of the regular food we can eat.
That's so great. So then, let's talk about your property. And you have about a half an acre with 30 raised beds. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we have just under a whole acre, but under production. Okay. I've got about a half acre under production. At this point, I have 30 raised beds. Most are 4 feet by 8 feet. Some are 4 feet by 10 feet. The main garden, has a symmetrical design to it. And then I have I wanted to extend a couple of years ago and add more beds, especially for things like garlic and potatoes and squash and pumpkins that, I didn't always want to grow in the main garden area because they either are in the garden a long time or take up a lot of room or wander, crazy throughout the garden. So I have 6 more beds outside the garden. Plus there's the polytunnel, which has 2 main long raised beds inside of it along each side. And then in the middle, I use fabric raised beds for spring, summer, fall to grow different types of crops in there. And then I even just sometimes pile up half rotted straw that might have been mulched the previous season, old potting mix from containers. All of those sorts of organic materials get piled up at the end of my garden. And then I often plant gourds and pumpkins and squash in there as well because it becomes quite a rich mix. So I have free-form beds. I have raised beds. I've gardened in in-ground gardens. And then, of course, I have the polytunnel. There's various cold frames. There's always stuff under production, no matter what time of year it is.
That's great. And these raised beds, are they made from a normal rot-resistant timber, or wood? What are they made from?
All my beds, actually, even the base of my polytunnel is made from local untreated cedar. Hemlock, not cedar. Local untreated hemlock, eastern hemlock. It's very rot resistant. So you really don't need to have it treated. It's also very heavy. So the boards I get are usually about 1.5 inches, thick, sold as 2-inch thick planks, but they're not quite that thick. And, depending on the bed, they could be 10 inches high or 8 inches high. My main beds are 16 inches high with 2 boards, to create the beds. I really wanted to raise them up since the bottom soil was very weedy and infertile. So I have high raised beds, but then I have areas where the beds are just 8 inches high. But even lifting those boards off the truck when they get delivered, they're so heavy. But they also, again, they last about 20 years, for the most part. Cold frames where I do bury them under the ground. I find I get about 12 years out of a cold frame made from untreated hemlock. And it's also an inexpensive wood, which has been great. It was cheaper, 10, 15, 20 years ago, but even now it's so much cheaper than something like cedar would be.
That's great. And were these sort of your own design? What do you fasten them with? Is this something that any person could just construct on their own at home?
Yeah, I think part of my mantra of my work with writing and making videos and online courses is basically doing whatever I do, I want somebody else to be able to do. I'm not, super handy, but I can build a raised bed. It's not that hard. I can build a cold frame. It's not that hard. And so I want people to realize they can too. So for the most part, they're just screwed together, my raised beds, very simply. It's a very simple design. And I do, of course, share photos on social media and things like that. And the newer 6 raised beds I put in a couple of years ago, my husband did surprise me by getting a local metal worker to make some really beautiful wrought iron end brackets. Yes, they do offer some support, but they're also just really ornamental. So they add a little bit of style to the garden as well. So, you can buy stainless steel brackets like that to fasten raised beds together. There's lots of kits out there nowadays as well as raised beds made from things like plastics and such. I do try to minimize my plastic use in the garden if I can. And if I do choose to bring a plastic product in, I want it to be something that's, going to be really resilient and last for a long time, such as if I'm building a mini hoop tunnel, I'm going to opt for, greenhouse plastic that's UV stabilized, it's going to last for years versus something like a plastic drop cloth sheet that will last for 2 months before it starts to break down. So I do think about that, when I'm using plastics in the garden.
Yeah. And then what do you fill the raised beds with? Do you have a combination of different materials, or actually first describe, do you have wheat cloth that you lay down first? Are they over virgin soil? What's your system?
So where my raised beds are, my main garden now, it was a garden beforehand that I had. It was just free-form beds at the time. So there was 2 large garden areas just kind of taking advantage of the space. One I think was 30 by 50 and one was 25 by 40. This is going back years, and they were free-formed beds. So when we created the new raised bed garden about 8 or 9 years ago, 2015, I think it was. So we actually scooped up all of that delicious soil that I had been feeding for so many years and saved it. And it managed to fill about 2/3 of the raised beds. The rest, I had to buy some organic, local garden soil, which I amended. I kind of, at the very bottom of the beds, I did put sheets of newspaper or sheets of cardboard, because there were some tenacious perennial weeds under there. So I did that, of course. We filled the beds. I did end up layering it. There was garden soil. There was some fine branches at the bottom, some seaweed, some shredded leaves, compost, manure, all that. But, for the most part, it's probably about 2/3 garden soil in there. It's hard to find good sources of garden soil to buy. So I always try to, manufacture it myself or amend it myself, of course. The soil I bought for my new raised beds a couple of years ago, it was supposed to be organic garden soil. It ended up being mixed with mulch, of course, to make it go further and save the company money. And because of that, nothing grew the first year. All that nitrogen was sucked up trying to break down those chunks of wood. And, I tested the soil and I talked to our leading soil expert here in the province. And unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do. So I planted cover crops for the first year and a half to build up the soil. And it's only last year that I was able to really get a good crop out of those new beds. So I do advise people, if they're buying soil, to go look at it first in the soil yard, to ask what's in it. Just to, you don't have a lot of control, of course, but just to try to do that if you can. And if you have time, you can, of course, make your own soil by layering materials and letting them break down.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a real challenge. And I know a lot of home gardeners, struggle with sourcing good soil or taking the time to make good soil. Do you ever recommend that people start off, if they want to get something going really quickly, just using potting soil, even though that can be expensive? Do you recommend them starting with that just to get something going?
No.
No. Okay.
I don't, mainly because it's peat-based and I'm trying to minimize my peat use. Peat bogs are so essential to our ecosystem. So we really need to stop harvesting peat for garden use, as they're doing now in the UK. And that's eventually going to come here. I know Canada has lots of peat bogs and, it's said to be harvested in a sustainable manner, but peat takes so long to really form and grow into a bog. And it should probably be left in the ground. So I don't really recommend that. And as well, peat is not a great, potting mix is not a great growing medium, in terms of, once it's, moist, it does of course retain some water, but it's a bit hydrophobic as well. So it's really not a great material and it doesn't have very many nutrients, and organic matter, so I don't generally recommend that. I know there's some people that recommend a special homemade mix, which is based on potting soil for raised beds. For intensive planting, but I have found that does not work very well. Yeah,
no, that's good to clarify, because I think a lot of people think that dirt soil is all the same, and there's no difference. So, okay, great. So you always recommend looking for an actual garden soil source, asking questions, and making sure that it is fairly
it's hard.
Good product. It is hard. Yeah. It's very hard.
Yeah. And particularly with the pandemic, I find too, so many people gardening, which is fantastic, but I found it was then harder to source materials, including even manures. For my garden, I always had a farmer that would, deliver me a beautiful truckload of aged manure for Mother's Day every year. And it was perfect. But unfortunately, they then needed to direct it more to their own farming and such, which of course makes sense. So it's only for 2 years, I had a lot of trouble finding manure for my garden. It's only this past fall that I was able to get a big load. And I have a giant pile now. I bought twice as much as I needed, and it's piled up beside my garden so I can keep amending the soil.
Yeah, no, that's important. And another sort of, I would say, common misconception that people don't always realize just how much you have to keep putting back into the soil.
You really do. And of course, there's cover crops that you can do it in a way that's less expensive. And such, but that takes time. And a lot of people, including myself, are love instant results pretty much. So, and another point I would like to make about soil is that I do test my soil every 2 years. More often if I find a bed is underperforming or something and I'm like, what's going on here? Because our soils on the East Coast tend to be acidic. So I also have to lime my soil every year. So usually October, November, I lime my soil. That does take time, of course, to alter the pH of your soil. So it's good to do that to make sure your soil, your pH is in a decent range for plant growth, which is generally between 6 and 7. And a soil test will do that. I recommend getting one done from your local extension office or your provincial extension office, just because it's far more accurate than those little kits you can buy.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. And then what, sort of visualizing the layout of your garden beds, do you have mulch in between the beds? What do you use to kind of keep the weed pressure down and all of that?
Yeah, I use my nieces and children generally. So between my beds, yes. So once we built the beds, it was bare soil because it had been an old garden. But I knew that, again, weeds would come back, the tenacious perennial weeds. So there's cardboard between all my beds covered in 2 to 3 inches of bark mulch. And I refresh that every 3 years or so. So I don't have to do it too much. And, then any weeds that do pop up, they're never allowed to go to seed. That's sort of my main rule. If you see a weed, pull it out. Don't let it go to seed, because then you're just giving yourself years of future problems. So yeah, I do actually employ the kids, as well as my nieces and nephews. I pay very well, and because most of them are in university now and they need the money. So, but ever since they were little, if they ever want to help with weeds or slug picking, I'm always happy to pay them in cookies and money.
That's good. And yes, and great way to educate them about where their food comes from and all of that too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's so many lessons from the garden. I mean, even like they can identify different species of bees now, native bees. They know why I'm growing milkweed around the garden. There's a lot of side lessons and tangents that they have learned from just being up there amongst the weeds. Sometimes they'll just stop and watch hummingbirds for half an hour. I mean, it's a magical place for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then what do you do for irrigation, or do you find that you need to irrigate or set up some sort of system?
I never used to have to irrigate quite so much because Mother Nature used to give us a nice deep rain once a week. Those days are gone. It's probably been 4 or 5 years since I could rely on that, maybe even a little longer. I have to check my notes. But so I hand water the main garden with a long handled watering wand. The things that get watered the most, of course, would be newly planted seeds or seedlings, as well as things like, say, peas or beans that are producing their flowers and their pods. They have obviously a higher water need than when they're younger plants. So those are things I would spot water more often. But generally, once a week, I'll go around the garden. Of course, every day or two if I have very newly planted things, but for the most part. And then I also use mulch. I use lots of straw or shredded leaves as mulch around tomatoes and peppers and squash and cucumbers and most of my vegetables, just to hold that soil moisture in and reduce the need to water. And also, when you have a high organic matter in your soil too, it does tend to hold more moisture. So those are some of the ways I try to, reduce my watering, but still make sure my plants have adequate moisture. Because if your plants are water stressed, greens, for example, are going to go to flower instead of produce lots of luscious leafy greens. And many other things will get bitter, or they just won't produce to their full potential. So paying attention to moisture is important. In my polytunnel, I also generally water by hand. I do have some soaker hoses, though, that I like to snake around the tomato plants, which makes it very easy. And I probably should get a little more serious about watering in terms of setting up some systems. But I like being out there hand watering. It takes maybe 40 minutes to do the whole garden once a week. And when I'm doing that, I'm monitoring. I'm looking for insect problems. I'm looking for disease problems. I'm just looking to see if the deer or groundhogs got in and nibbled on something. It kind of keeps me connected to the garden. I realize that people with bigger properties or, obviously market gardeners need more of a solution than hand watering. But for me, it works. And it gives me that chance to connect with the garden.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Watering, yes, can feel tedious and time consuming, but yes, it does offer that great way to observe what you have going on and make adjustments, accordingly. So, but if, there was someone who didn't have that 40 minutes or that time, what would you recommend on your scale for a system? Would you do more soaker hoses? Would you do wobbler heads, some sort of overhead system? What would you lean towards?
I would lean towards soaker hoses. The only problem with overhead systems and sprinklers and things like that is that you're wetting the foliage. And say, for example, you're working and you get home and supper time, and I'm going to turn on the sprinklers for, half an hour. Then those leaves are going to sit wet most of the night, likely, depending on your weather. And that, of course, can easily spread so many different types of pathogens. So I don't recommend, if you're going to use a sprinkler, do so early in the morning if you can. That's the best advice I have in terms of watering, really. And when I do water with my long-handled watering wand, I always direct the water at the base of the plant. So I'm watering the soil, not the plants. Of course, leaves get wet here and there, but that's why I do try to water in the morning. So that's something that I always try to practice, and I recommend it. But soaker hoses work, quite well. And I know there's lots of raised bed systems you can buy too. for, running different lines for irrigating your raised beds. It's just that where I had 30, it didn't make a lot of sense for me to invest that much time and money, into irrigating my beds that way. And where I'm constantly cycling plants through, I'd always be running new lines, around the new formations of the plants and stuff. It just seemed like more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah. Yeah. So now what about the big pests, deer, rabbits, all of those things? Do you have any sort of fencing? What do you do? Because a lot of people, commercial growers know that a deer fence is pretty essential and generally will invest in that if they can. But on a home scale, that is, it's either difficult to do or not super practical. So I'm curious what you do.
Yeah, I've gardened in deer country since day one. So when I was a kid, we had no fence. And I would just get frustrated, and there's not much you could do about it when tomatoes were topped and beans were nibbled and peas and such. But in my own garden, I have tried many types of barriers over the years, from, rocks around the garden they didn't want to walk on, to deer netting all around the perimeter of the garden, the 7 foot by 100 foot lengths. But there were times you'd watch them go to the base of that, look up, and then jump right over the 7 feet. So, I did probably about a decade ago switch to an electric fence with 4 strings. And that has been about, I'd say 98% effective keeping deer out of the garden. Sometimes the little ones will try to sneak in. But the day after I put my deer fence in, I had gone up to the garden and I noticed a lot of things were nibbled. And I was like, okay, what has happened? And I turned around because of the corner of my eye, I could see something. There were 2 groundhogs, just like, I think you might call them, I can't remember the American name for groundhogs, but
we call them groundhogs too.
Okay. Yeah. Woodchucks, I guess woodchucks.
Yeah.
They were just sitting there like this, eating my beans, like.
Oh.
So, and the next day I put in chicken wire all around the very bottom of my supports to keep them out. And there was one time, maybe 5 years ago, they dug under that chicken wire, but it's been quite effective. So at this point, I have few large pests because the rabbits, the deer, and the groundhogs cannot generally get in unless they're just really, really desperate to get in.
Yeah. And you would recommend someone putting in the time to do some sort of electric fence or physical barrier for sure.
Yeah. My older sister has a garden just down the road from me, and she has 2 raised beds. And so she just has posts on the 4 corners where the 2 raised beds are, and has it surrounded by the deer netting. And in the small garden with 2 raised beds, that works great. The netting's just attached on nails, and she can open like a little door from the netting and get between the 2 raised beds to tend them. So that works fine for her, but if you have a large garden, investing in some sort of barrier or fence is essential. And I would have loved a more decorative fence, to be honest, but that would have cost a lot of money. Whereas I was able to put the electric fence in for, I think it was about $350 at the time. And knock on wood, all my original parts are still working. So yeah, it's been a good investment.
Yeah, good. So I'd love to sort of hear about, what a year might look like in your gardens. So we could maybe start with spring and go through all the way to the following spring. You could maybe talk about a few beds in particular as example crops, and how would you cycle it through to get full year-round production and harvest?
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's that's several books worth. But it's definitely fun to think about the garden in the sense of a full year. Like, for example, early spring, late winter, we're almost finished eating now from the polytunnel, all the things we had there. There's a few beets and carrots left, and some parsley, a few lettuce heads, and some spinach. So once they're done, which will be very soon, usually by mid to late February, I'll amend the soil with some of the manure. And I do keep some in my garage just for this purpose, a little bit in some Rubbermaid bins, so I can amend in the greenhouse early and it's not a frozen block. And then I will plant again. Our day length is over 10 hours. We've got enough light for so many different types of crops. And, right now, if I look, it is -8 outside Celsius, but the greenhouse is 21 degrees Celsius. So I could be up there in a bathing suit right now. It is beautiful. So it's warm enough in there that I could be planting again. So that is the first place I start. I clean out the cold frames this time of the year. At this point, there's not very much left in them. We've eaten pretty much everything in them. So I'm going to clean them out, amend them, and start planting again. And then in another month or so, I'll do the same with the mini hoop tunnels that are in the garden. So I still have a few crops under there we're still picking at, some leeks and scallions and some lettuces, some Salanova lettuces. And when they're done, again, I'll amend the soil and start planting in there, because those little mini greenhouses in the garden warm up so much earlier, and the soil warms up, and I'll start planting lots of different types of salad greens and Asian greens and root vegetables like turnips and radishes and more baby carrots and things like that for spring. So those are the first things I'm doing in early spring. And then as the snow melts and the beds unfreeze, the ones that weren't covered, some beds are mulched. So if the carrots are done from those mulch beds, I'll remove the mulch so the soil can warm up. And then I'll start planting the earliest vegetables using mini hoop tunnels and row covers and things like that to extend the season by 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the crop. The cabbages will go in, the broccolis, the brassicas and such. And then, we're getting into late spring, early summer when all of a sudden the garden explodes, with all of the heat-loving vegetables. I do start lots of things indoors. I have 4 sets of grow lights. There's 4 sets of tiered grow lights. So I start about 20 flats at a time. And right now I do have in the basement artichokes growing because I want to make sure I get the short season artichoke harvest. I also do overwinter artichokes in my polytunnel. They're deep mulched and they do survive the winter. So we start to harvest those by late April, early May. And then the new ones will go in the garden. And summer is all the heat lovers. All those seedlings get transplanted. A lot of things get direct seeded. And then as the early crops are done, I'm succession planting more things. And by midsummer, the carrots for fall and winter are going in, and I'm starting indoors under my grow lights again so I can plant out more salad greens and other crops for succession planting, cabbages and broccolis and cauliflowers. And then autumn, of course, is also a very productive time in the garden with so many different types of vegetables. I'm using mini hoop tunnels again. I'm using row covers and plastic covered tunnels. The cold frames are filling up. The greenhouse is full. As soon as the tomatoes and such are done down the middle of the greenhouse, those fabric temporary raised beds are cleaned out and removed. So I have all that space for working in winter. And the side beds are full of food. And then in winter, we're just harvesting. There's no slugs, there's no deer, there's no rabbits to get the crops. They're all protected. There's no aphids. There's nothing like that I need to worry about. I don't usually water in winter. I have noticed with the warming winters, that's changed a little bit. I did water about 3 weeks ago on a very mild day that we had. I pulled out the hoses and hooked them up in deep water. Then I drained them again and put them all away. So normally I haven't had to water in winter, but that's starting up a little bit more with the change in climate. And then we're back again into late winter and early spring, starting to plant again. So, I try to keep it manageable because even though the garden is my full-time job, it's only a small part of what I do. And it seems the more writing and everything else I do, the less time I have for the garden. So I have to make it a priority and I have to be well organized. I kind of have to make sure I know what to do at what time, so I do have journals and such and reminders in my computer like, hey, start some more lettuce seeds indoors because I just find having reminders just makes it so much easier for me.
Today's episode of the Winter Growers Podcast is brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count, and I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmer's Friend. In a world where the threat of food insecurity is quickly becoming the new norm, Farmer's Friend exists to equip, educate, and inspire growers to change the world through regenerative agriculture. Small farms are the future, and the future is now. If you need quality tools and supplies for your vegetable or flower operation, check out their growing selection of innovative and affordable tunnels, tools, tarps, and much more. Here at my home farm, we rely heavily on Farmer's Friend for our production. We have 3 of their Caterpillar tunnels. We use the silage tarps for occultation. Their row covers have gotten us through hard winters. And of course, the Quick Cut Greens Harvester has sped up our baby greens harvest tremendously. Visit farmersfriend.com/no-till today. That's farmersfriend.com/no-till, or visit the link in the show notes and get free shipping on your entire order. All right, back to the show.
And so then how do you typically organize all your beds to deal with both, crop rotation, and then also having space available for things that you might need to sow or transplant still fairly early in the, season, in the fall season, but not, but still you still might have tomatoes or other crops in the ground and you don't want to necessarily pull them out. Do you intentionally have empty space, bed space ready for that? How do you organize that?
Yeah, I do generally have empty bed space ready for that. So something like bush beans that came out of the garden in mid-August, they're going to be, or early August, they're going to be replaced with something for fall or winter, like cabbages or broccoli. So yeah, I do have a crop rotation plan, which, I stick to very seriously because crop rotation is so important for disease prevention and insect, prevention, of course, as well as, even nutrient depletion from the soil. So I do stick to my crop rotation plan, and I organize it by families, which I find is easiest. So, the tomatoes, the potatoes, the peppers, the eggplants, they're all related. So, I don't plant them in the same spot from year to year. I think crop rotation is one of the harder, sort of skills for people to learn when they're new to gardening. And so for someone new, I would just say, just keep moving things around. Mm-hmm. And as you, learn more about it, you'll divide them up by family. And then you'll even follow certain families with other families, something that's really greedy, like cabbages or broccoli, will get followed by something that builds soil, like the legumes, the peas and the beans. So those are just things you learn as you go along, but it is really important to practice crop rotation. So yeah, in summertime, I do have lots of things like I'll succession plant cucumbers 3 times. So once, the cucumbers are finished, say the second crop, by mid-August, then those will come out and I'll be putting in again, more sprouting broccoli for fall or winter. I'll be planting more greens, more beets at that point. It just depends what was in the bed beforehand and then what comes next. But I do try to roughly sketch it out, so I draw out a map of all of my 30 beds. And then it's like, first crop is this, second crop is this, third crop is this. And one bed isn't necessarily dedicated to one crop. One bed might have, beets and carrots and turnips to start, for example, or beets and spinach to start, or just lettuce, all different varieties, maybe 3 or 4 varieties for a really beautiful visual, as well as lots of delicious leaves. So I just kind of write that down, and then it'll be the next crop that's going to go there and the next crop. And then, of course, between successive crops, I will put down a little more manure or compost, as well as some organic vegetable fertilizers, and then plant there. I don't deep dig my beds anymore. I don't do any tilling anymore. I try to leave the soil ecosystem as it is. Just because obviously it is a living ecosystem, and if we disturb it constantly, our plants are not going to get the full benefit. So I try to leave it as is.
Great. And then with some of the protection that you use, obviously there's RIME, row cover, many different names for that fabric. Plastic can be used. What you talk about, you have these mini tunnels. What do those look like? How are they supported? Describe that for our listeners.
So my mini hoop tunnels just have 2 parts, basically, hoops and a cover. Mm-hmm. And the cover and the hoops actually that I choose to use will depend on the season and the purpose for the protection. So, I use garden covers from cloches, and mini hoop tunnels and cold frames and greenhouses and all these different types of garden covers for weather protection. Hot and cold. It's not just about the winter garden, because with hot summers, sometimes you're going to need some protection for newly planted and transplanted seeds and seedlings from the hot sun. Or, if we're having a really hot spell, you can just reduce the ambient temperature underneath by using something like shade cloth. So I'm using garden covers for weather protection. I'm using them for insect and larger pest protection. And I'm using them just to give the plants a really strong start in spring, because the plants get a really nice, strong, healthy start, lots of moisture, protection from up and down temperatures, and they're going to just grow more vigorously and produce a better crop. So I use them mainly for those 3 reasons, creating microclimates, pest protection, of course, and weather protection. So mini hoop tunnel might be, if it's just a really temporary one in spring, say I've just got some lettuces I just want to give a little bit of frost protection to, I might just use an ungauge wire, cut into little lengths, maybe 6 or 7 foot lengths over top the bed, just 2 or 3, depending how big the area is to cover. I float the row cover over top. And that'll offer protection. If I'm protecting, say, cabbages from cabbage worms in the summer, I'll probably use like a PVC hoop, like a 1/2-inch PVC conduit bent over the bed. Again, depending on whether I need one whole bed, I use 3 hoops for. So it depends if one whole bed is being used. And then I'll cover that with like lightweight RIME, row cover, insect barrier, netting, things like this that you can buy from garden supply stores and online as well. And that'll still allow light and water and air to pass through, but it'll prevent the insects from getting in there, which is nice. Or even something larger. You can use them for flea beetles, cucumber beetles, squash bugs. The only thing is if you're using an insect netting long-term for pest prevention, make sure you're using it on crops that don't need to be pollinated, like potatoes, things like that, cabbages, broccoli. They don't need to be pollinated to produce their crop. if you're using them to prevent cucumber beetles or squash bugs, make sure that as soon as the plants begin to flower, you remove the cover. So, bees and other pollinators can make sure that you're going to get lots of cucumbers and squash on your plants. Another thing in my garden beds too, they're packed with different vegetables. I definitely practice diversity because I find that helps spoil some insects as well. If I just have beds of cabbage, for example, it's sort of like a sign, come eat me, but if I interplant that with other crops, and if I add lots of flowers and herbs, it attracts a lot of beneficial insects. So, you might look at my vegetable garden in summer and you're seeing sunflowers and nasturtiums and cosmos and marigolds. And you're like, where are the vegetables? They're there. But the garden is probably 85% vegetables and 15 to 20% flowers. So oftentimes the flowers kind of take center stage as well.
Yeah, well, and they look beautiful. So
yeah, I love the look. And of course, my mom comes and picks bouquets a couple times a week. So it's perfect.
Yeah, no, it's great how flowers can be both, insect deterrents, and they also offer incredible beauty for the dining room table. So
exactly, which is a benefit really of a home garden. You know what I mean? Like I can plant. I'm not trying to produce a crop to feed, farmers markets and maximize my crop potential. I can grow what I want in terms of mixing it up and trying new crops and experimenting. And even though it's not as big a space as a market gardener would have, I think home gardeners get to play a little more sometimes.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so where do you source most of the materials that you might be using? Or do you have, what are your favorite, sources for these materials?
I mean, honestly, for things like, I also have a metal bender. So I do make metal hoops, which are incredibly sturdy for winter protection. So if I'm making mini hoop tunnels for winter, they're going to be made out of 1/2-inch metal conduit because it's just so strong and resilient and durable. So a lot of these things, for example, the metal conduit, the PVC conduit, the 9-gauge wire is sourced from my local home, like building supply store. And most of the types of structures I make are very inexpensive to do, although I have noticed metal conduit has definitely shot up the past couple of years. Covers I can buy from my local garden supply store, but I'll also order them online because I tend to use a lot of covers. I've ordered a lot of them in terms of by the roll instead of by a folded package of a 10 by 20 row cover. It makes more economic sense to buy it. It's much cheaper per the square foot when you buy a roll. So if I'm, using greenhouse poly for mini hoop tunnels and such, I'm going to buy a roll. Sometimes the local greenhouse supply store has a damaged roll. I can get it at a good deal. And then I'll cut it up into the lengths that I want and store the rest of the roll in my garden shed. And a roll can last me 10 years or more because greenhouse poly is quite thick and it's quite durable and it doesn't break down so quickly and it's UV stabilized. 6-year or 4-year greenhouse poly, which is 6 mil thick, tends to last me about 8 years in the garden. And then I recycle it. So I tend to buy by the roll. It's easier, it's cheaper, and I just store the extra. If people were part of a garden club or community garden, it's a nice thing for the club to invest in, and then everybody can have a chunk of it. And again, it's so much cheaper than everybody buying their own lengths of greenhouse covers or row covers or things like that. And shade cloth is another cover I use a lot of. And I just buy it at my, greenhouse supply store. It's something that is so durable and it's so useful. In the summer garden, I often use shade cloth floated on my hoops to help me establish, midsummer planted crops when the soil is hot and dry. It helps reduce the water evaporation from the soil so it stays more moist for good germination rates and helps those seedlings settle in. So I think shade cloth is a cover that not a lot of people have learned to use in a home garden. But with, again, the changing environment and climate, we're going to be using it a lot more as we try to create some shade and cool down certain crops in the middle of summer.
Yeah. No, when I was farming in Colorado, it was pretty essential to use shade cloth over high tunnels, even in, certain garden areas. So yes.
Yeah.
Maine, less so, but as you said, as climate is changing, unfortunately, we might have to change our practices too. So now the polytunnel, the high tunnel you have it, in my notes here is 14 feet by 24. So what would you say is the primary use, the best advantage of that structure? And what does that space look like year round? What would you have? It's February now that we're speaking. What is in there right now?
Right now there is spinach, lettuce, turnips, some carrots and beets left, and beets for beet greens, as well as the delicious roots. I've got some golden ones and rainbow ones and heirloom ones. There's some parsley in there. There's my overwintering artichokes. there's a very miniature lavender hedge just because I love it. And when it blooms pretty much from late April until October, and the bumblebees in there, there'll be hundreds at a time. And so that's probably what's left there now. And then last fall, I did plant about 100 tulip bulbs. So they'll start to pop up soon. I usually do plant some cut flowers like that, some bulbs, so I can cut bouquets for my mom and mother-in-law. And they usually start to bloom about 6 weeks earlier than they would outside. So then by the time I want that space for transplanting tomatoes in early May, at that point, the bulbs are done, and I'm just going to use that space for heat-loving crops. So the polytunnel, I mean, it's a game changer in a garden. I know we've had a gardening boom, with the pandemic the past 3 years, but we've also had a greenhouse boom. So many people are putting in home greenhouses. I chose a polytunnel, and I chose this specific, model because I know the person who designed it. He's been working in greenhouses in France and Nova Scotia and all across Atlantic Canada for like 30, 40 years. And he designed a structure that would be perfect for a small market gardener or a home gardener who really want a protected space for winter harvesting, for starting seeds, for growing cut flowers. It's stood up to about 8 hurricanes so far, more nor'easters than I can name. Winds up to about 140 kilometers an hour. I don't know what that is in imperial, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's laughed it all off. There's times I'll wake up after a hurricane and go, there's no way that cover is still on the greenhouse. And yet it is. So, it's been a great structure for me. It's made of very, great oval steel tubing. So it's got a great snow load. It's very strong. So that's why I went with this model. And, when we first built it and put it up and I stood inside it, I thought, how am I ever going to fill this space? And it took a week. That's it. And then I thought, why didn't I go bigger? Why didn't I get another one, end to end? Of course, my neighbor wouldn't have liked half his backyard to be my greenhouse. But yeah, so it's a great space. And, and so I get like a much earlier start, like 10 weeks earlier for many types of crops in spring. And then of course in summer, living in an East Coast maritime climate, you can't always, at least you didn't used to be able to rely on a lot of summer heat. So it's a great covered space, a microclimate for all the heat lovers, the hot peppers, the tomatoes, the melons, things like that, the artichokes. So, it's completely filled vertically with all the trusses and my supports all summer long. And then it cycles again at the end of summer into root vegetables and salad greens to keep us going. And of course, cold season herbs all winter long. So it really has more than doubled my winter production by having that space. And it's comfortable. It's great to go out there and work. It's more comfortable than working and reaching into mini hoop tunnels. I still love my cold frames, however, but the covered space of a greenhouse is definitely an amazing asset to a garden.
Yeah, no, I mean, very much so. And a lot of times the initial investment can deter a lot of home gardeners or the space. But I agree. It is a complete game changer and gives you so much more ease, I think, in doing a lot of the winter growing, especially.
Yeah.
So.
And there's a lot of structures available out there. Some of them are very flimsy. Some of them are made from polycarbonate and it's only 4 millimeters thick. It does not stand up. They'll blow out in a strong wind. Aluminum sometimes supports just not strong enough. So I would say make sure you're investing in a structure that's appropriate for your climate and what you're going to get in terms of snow load. It might cost a little more. It might not. I mean, my polytunnel was very reasonable. It was cheaper than one of those 8x10 polycarbonate, greenhouses you can buy from the hardware store or whatever. But it's just so much stronger. And the advantage of having a long tunnel, like a high tunnel, is I can roll up the sides. It's such an easy way to ventilate, reduce humidity, get airflow through, reduce disease problems. So, when you have a greenhouse structure, you have to make sure you've got good venting. You might need fans to get that air to flow. And I don't run electricity up to my greenhouse. I don't have a heater in there. I'm relying on solar energy for everything. So roll-up sides definitely make it so easy to ventilate that structure.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just realized we didn't cover any of the cold frames. It's it's not as common that you hear people using cold frames. So what are yours made out of? And just describe what you think the advantages of them are.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started using cold frames, it wasn't something you could buy. You had to build your own if you wanted them. And that was about 25 years ago. So that has certainly changed because now a lot of our local garden centers carry cold frame kits or polycarbonate cold frames you can just kind of pop over here and there, like portable frames, which is fantastic. So mine are mostly made from the untreated local hemlock, very rot resistant 2-inch thick lumber. The latest one I bought, I built to match a window frame. I built this past summer, so the window frame could be the top. But I also love building them 3 feet by 6 feet is my ideal size. And then I like to use a sheet of polycarbonate, like double twin wall, 8 mil thick polycarbonate. I'll use for the top, just build a little frame around that polycarbonate. And that's a perfect cold frame. 3 by 6 feet gives you lots of growing space. It's not so heavy that the top is, because I've seen a lot of 4 by 8 foot cold frames and the tops are very heavy. And if they blow down, they slam. So I like 3 foot by 6 foot is my ideal cold frame size. And again, for the tops, I've used so many different options. I tend not to use glass because I've seen glass shatter. I've also seen deer stand on top of my polycarbonate cold frame tops, or neighbors' dogs. So the new one I built from the window frame, it was an empty window frame I got for $5 from like a recycling building supply store. And I just used greenhouse poly, stapling it to the top and bottom of the window frame. So I have a double-sided, polyethylene window frame covered top for my cold frame. And it lets in about probably 85% of the sunlight through. It's nice and insulating. It was super cheap to build. And that should hopefully last the polyethylene, unless it rips or something, for the next 8 to 10 years.
Yeah, no, that's great. Do you use any automated venting with those Univent? Are you familiar with the Univent hinge arms that basically expand when the temperature increases? They have wax that will expand and open up the vent on its own. Do you use any of those, or?
I don't. I mean, I'm familiar with the products, but I don't, because it's an extra expense. And again, I try to do it. Everything I do, I want other people to be able to emulate and copy. So I don't. I just prop them open, sometimes with like a stick. I'm not super fancy with it. So I know if the temperature is going to be above freezing on a sunny day, I'm going to prop it open a couple inches till, depending on the season. I might open it all the way if it's like spring or early mid-autumn. Or if we're going to get a rain, I might open it all the way so we can have that soil be nicely irrigated. But I always err on the side of venting, because if you're growing your crops colder, venting more often, they're going to grow stronger and just be more vigorous and durable to temperature fluctuations. If you always have the tops closed, they're going to put on a lot of soft growth, which is also more attractive to insects like aphids, as well as cold damage. When the temperature does go down, they're not going to be as resilient in terms of their hardiness. So I try to err on the side of venting, and I vent a lot in my cold frames. Yeah. But I also have, I do have 2 cold frames that I bought that were cold frame kits, because I like to test out different models against my own and such. And I have one European polycarbonate model from Lee Valley that is like a nice thick polycarbonate, and it's really nice structure, easy to vent because it's got a screen on top. And then to make it a little more winter hardy, because polycarbonate cold frames don't have wooden bases, so they certainly aren't as insulating in winter. So I just hill up leaves and straw and soil and evergreen boughs around the outside to obviously give it more insulation for winter. And then I have another one that's made from cedar and quite thin, 4 mil thick polycarbonate. And it's 3 years old now, and it's definitely not as strong. Like, I find it's more flimsy in terms of a cold frame. So again, if you're looking for a cold frame and you want to buy a product, just, if you can look at a floor model or something and kind of see how strong it's going to be, I would recommend that, and just keep that in mind. Cheaper is not always better.
Yeah. And, it's great that you are able to monitor, and you also have the expertise to know when to vent. But a lot of people starting out don't have, the knowledge, or they aren't physically there to do it. So it's always trying to figure out how can you encourage these other methods without sort of having to be basically imprisoned by your garden.
And I talk about that a lot in my books as well.
Yeah.
Like, how to determine when to vent. And basically, if you go to work for the day, then prop it open an inch or two if the temperature is looking at the forecast. And then, when you go off to work, and then when you get back in the evening or late afternoon, then you close it up again. So there's definitely challenges for people that aren't home as much. And you can certainly buy automatic movers and such like that to open them too.
Yeah. And always, our rule of thumb has always been always err on the side of too cool than too hot. So
100%. Yeah. I mean, I have experimented with that, and it is so true. There's nothing worse than coming back to, a high tunnel or cold frame and having like this sort of disgusting soup of like green mess that is just sort of cooked and well, just to let people know that everybody makes mistakes. Like, so I think it was 3 springs ago, I had all of my tomato seedlings hardening off in the greenhouse, and it was probably early May, and and they've been up there overnight because it wasn't that cold. And it wasn't until late morning, and I looked at the temperature in the greenhouse, because I have a thermometer right here behind me that tells me the greenhouse temperature, and it was 42 Celsius. which is probably 110 Fahrenheit or something. And I had not opened the sides. I just forgot. I had all these deadlines and I was working. And then I was like, when I ran up, and I did lose half my seedlings.
Yeah.
It was pretty devastating. So it happens to everybody.
It definitely does. Yeah. What, I guess, with some of the winter experimentation you've done, what has been the most surprising crop for you? Because it's always like so much of this, you never quite can anticipate, how hardy something is and what all the different variables that influence its hardiness and its resilience. What has been the most surprising crop, I guess, for you in that process?
There's so many. Like the whole concept of it has been a surprise to me, thinking back to when I started gardening and not realizing the incredible potential of what we can do. And the fact that still, if I go to the grocery store, all of the spinach, all of the arugula, all of the lettuce was grown in California. It astounds me. Like here, I mean, have we not learned anything in the past 20, 30 years? But I would say things like mosh, or corn salad is amazing, because the first few years I grew it, I mean, it certainly promiscuously spreads around my garden. It gets everywhere. It's a very vigorous self-seeder. But you'll have, like right now, we've got a foot of snow outside. When that melts, the mosh will be fine. Like it is not going to be touched at all by that, 1 month of snow on top of it. It doesn't care. Like, tatsoi, Yucchina Savoy, some of the cold tolerances of some of these crops, the winter boar kale. It just really takes me by surprise, because oftentimes I'm experimenting with how things go in the garden, and I'll have a certain crop under, a mini hoop tunnel, in a cold frame, in the greenhouse, and in the open garden. And sometimes it does just fine in the open garden all winter long. So, to me, it's always interesting to see how the different types of garden covers affect the durability and such, and resilience of a crop. So, I would say mosh has always surprised me in terms of it's just so hardy. But also some of the lettuces, like how, incredibly cold hardy they are too. It's always surprising to me that so many types of crops can be harvested in the winter. A lot of people, think, oh, you're just eating kale in the winter. But, that is such a tiny portion of what we're eating from, Asian greens, of which there's dozens of types, and scallions, and the different winter lettuces, and the hardy broccolis, and the cabbages, then all the root vegetables and the herbs. So there's such diversity in the winter garden. So to me, that is maybe the most surprising aspect.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And, I was recently talking with a grower in Georgia, and right before Christmas last year, they had that horrible cold snap that came through, which is not common, and obviously becoming more common with climate change. And one of the challenges, that I see with that is the hardening off process that is so essential for a lot of these cold hardy crops to be resilient in the cold temps. You don't get that down there. If suddenly it goes from 70 degrees down, or, Fahrenheit down to, 10 below Fahrenheit, the crop can't deal with that as easily. But they did say, though, one of, their standout crop was spinach. So it's always great to hear, how resilient spinach is, that, if we have Armageddon, we'll always have spinach, or we'll always have mosh, right?
It's the cockroach of the botanical world.
Exactly. So
yeah, it's true. But that's good to know that even though it wasn't acclimatized to cold temperatures, it still did well for them. Yeah.
Yeah. But other things did not, like, some of the cabbages that they thought might have done okay, or cauliflower did not.
Right.
Because it just froze solid and then kind of turned to mush, after it thawed. So, and then, so anyway, so it's curious to see all the different, effects of cold and how things can rebound and how sometimes they just simply can't. So,
and I mean, one of the things I think we're seeing with climate change is that it's just more unpredictable ups and downs. So, it's not just that my summers here in Nova Scotia are hotter and drier, but we're just getting, like, all of a sudden, like, for example, a couple of days ago here, it was minus 45 Celsius, which is pretty much minus 45 Fahrenheit. And I know it was across much of North America. But now, then like tomorrow, it's supposed to be 14 Celsius, which is about, 65.
Yeah.
I mean, in less than a week. We're getting much more of those massive temperature fluctuations. So that is probably going to have to, at some point, play into my planning. And I'm going to have to consider that. And I haven't quite wrapped my head around it yet, but that's something I need to think about.
Yeah, no. And one of the things that I've really recommended to growers is, more high tunnel structures, because you can control those variances a little bit easier than having things just be outside. So
that's good advice. Yeah.
Especially wind, as long as the structure is well built, the wind can rip those row covers off, anything that, you're trying to use to protect. So but it's a lot of challenges. So well, I guess before we jump into the lightning round, I'd love to hear a little bit about where people can find, all of your information, how they can learn more about you. So just give everyone the rundown.
So my website is savvygardening.com, and I own that with two other garden horticulturists, Tara Nolan from Toronto and Jessica Walliser, who is a bug expert and a bug nerd. She loves good bugs, bad bugs, and she writes a lot about science-based companion planting. So the three of us cover a lot of territory in growing food and flowers and tackling insects and encouraging pollinators. So it's a lot of fun. So savvygardening.com. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and YouTube too, of course, sharing successes and sometimes failures from my garden. Like, for example, when I did accidentally forget my tomato seedlings in my greenhouse, a lot of people would say, I'm not telling people I did that, but I immediately put it on social media so people know that this happens to everybody. And the feedback was tremendous. So many people shared their own stories. And I mean, it's just a growing opportunity. I tell people a dead plant is a composting opportunity and a garden screw up is a growing opportunity. So, so that's generally where you can find me, and online and social media, and it's Savvy Gardening.
Great. And what are your,
I guess, my books.
You've got, you have a number of books, but what are the specific ones for winter growing, or what are those ones?
Yeah. So I have 4 books. The first one, The Year-Round Vegetable Gardener, has sold like 150,000 copies. And that's all about, say, for example, like all the different types of crops, and then how to grow them in cold frames and mini hoop tunnels and in green, like how to grow them year round, how to get them growing in summer, all that sort of stuff. So it covers all 12 months and all 4 seasons. And then my latest is Growing Under Cover, which then also tackles using high tunnels and small greenhouses and geodesic domes. And again, just builds on that. And then I also offer a lot of advice, like how do you then train your tomatoes if you're growing them in a greenhouse? What do you do for your peppers? Do you pinch them? So more specific growing information for using these types of covers. And then not only how they're great for weather and year-round gardening in terms of hot and cold weather, but also pest prevention, big and small, and all that sort of stuff. So, and I cover systems and watering and all that fun stuff as well in Growing Under Cover.
Great. Yeah. And then you used to have a radio show, but you've discontinued that. Is that correct?
I have. I know my radio station's not happy with me, but after 15 years of every Sunday, live 2 hours, I did last year. I wrapped up 15 years and I thought this is a good place to stop. I mean, I loved it. I talked to gardeners from all around the world. I learned so much every single week. It was amazing. But it's time for me to have my weekends back and actually be able to travel and do things and not be tied down quite as much. So I discontinued my radio show, although I do love it. And I do still, I'm now the CBC radio expert here in Nova Scotia or the Maritime Provinces. So for one of our large, it's sort of like the NPR. But in Canada. So I am their gardening expert now. And I do twice monthly, 1 hour call-ins where people just ask me any type of gardening question they want. And I answer them. So I still am on the radio, just on a different station and a different format for sure.
That's great. And is there an archive of your radio show? So could people pull it up if they wanted?
Yeah. So my station was News 95.7. And if they just Google News 95.7 and Niki Jabbour, they'll find the archive for the Weekend Gardener. I don't think they have all 15 years, which is good because the first couple I was not so smooth and polished. But I think there's a couple of years worth of shows there with some lots of different experts on every matter, like every topic of food gardening and soil building and flower growing. And I've just talked to so many different incredible people over the years.
Yeah, so that's great. Well, good. Well, I hope listeners can find all of that information easily enough and keep learning. So
yes.
Well, good. Well, let's jump into the lightning round, which has been a favorite part of this podcast. I'm always so fascinated by people's answers and curious what they're going to say. So ready to get going?
Sure, let's do it. Pressure's on. Okay.
Okay. So number 1 is your favorite crops and varieties.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to pick one, but I'm going to say lettuce. Because it's something I have in the garden no matter what time of year it is. I love it. We eat lettuce every day. It's such a delicious, tender, sweet green. I mean, arugula is my favorite salad green, but lettuce is just such a superstar. And my salad Nova lettuces would be my favorite, mainly because they're just so cold tolerant. They go all winter long, no problem. They're great. They have heat tolerance as well. They're packed with leaves, really dense. So I've been growing them for about 5 years. And I'm very happy with pretty much like all of them, but I love green butterhead, red butterhead. Other lettuces that I love too include things like winter density, North Pole. I love the butterheads. Oh my gosh, the salad from just harvested butterhead lettuce from the garden. It is art. It's so beautiful. So I would say lettuce, and those are some of my favorite varieties.
Yeah, that's great. Let's see here. What is your favorite crop to cook or eat? I guess you kind of answered that a little bit. What about to cook?
I love cauliflower, which is hard to grow. Okay, I admit it's hard to grow. I only grow cauliflower in autumn because it does not do well for me if I try it in spring. Too much up and down in terms of temperature. So I love growing it in autumn. I love the purples, the oranges. I love the Romanesca, the green, swirly, beautiful heads. I love all cauliflower. I love sprouting cauliflower. I love roasting it in the oven. It's just so delicious. So, I can roast it in the oven, a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of salt on top, and I will eat a giant pan of cauliflower because it is so, so good.
Do your kids love it too? Or
yeah, they do. They do. I mean, they're adults now, right? So they do love it. But also, like Swiss chard is another favorite because my husband is Lebanese, and I love to grow crops for his family and his parents, things that might have been familiar in Lebanon. And I've got a lot of the family seeds and stuff now, which I've shared with local seed companies. I've been learning to make his mother's fatire, and she doesn't use spinach. She uses Swiss chard in it. So I love growing a rainbow of Swiss chard so I can cook fatire, the little pockets of, like feta cheese and the Swiss chard and the sumac and the onions. And oh my gosh, they're so good. I'm going to make some today, actually. I just picked a little Swiss chard from the tunnel.
Yum, that sounds delicious. What gets you up in the morning?
Tea. Basically, the thought that I can have a hot pot of tea is what finally gets me out of bed. Yeah. I'm not a sleeper inner anyway, but I love to come down and make my first pot of tea.
What's your favorite tea?
Just like like an orange pico, like a black tea is all I need. And I like to have it. I have a little teapot with a nice teacup. And that's how I start my day. I usually start, working, whether it's writing deadlines or responding to emails or what have you, by like 7:30. So having a pot of tea beside me makes that more enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. What's your favorite tool? We never really talked about too many tools. So what is your favorite tool?
With raised beds, your tool choices sometimes change depending on the height of your bed. So like long handled tools aren't always, as easy to use when you have a really high raised bed, for example. I mean, my favorite tools would be a collinear hoe, because it's so great at taking out weeds and chopping them off. But I also love a garden fork. I've always loved a garden fork for harvesting and to sometimes, moving your compost and shredded leaves and all that sort of stuff. And then, just for weeding, like, a cobra head or a garden knife is so useful as well, short handled, which is nice in a raised bed. So those would be the ones that are pretty essential for me. Great.
What is your favorite music that you listen to while gardening?
I actually prefer podcasts. When I'm gardening. Yeah. So I'm big on the podcasts and everything from gardening podcasts like yours, as well as comedy podcasts and science podcasts. And then probably the podcasts I listen to most are history podcasts, because that was my first degree and I still have a very large interest in history and such. So I listen to a lot of history podcasts too. And I love it. I get to learn something as I'm working in the garden and enjoying the space and such. And so that's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Yep.
What is your favorite way to relax or self-care activity? And how do you take care of your body, heart, and mind as a gardener?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot. I like to read a lot of nonfiction. Again, coming back to history a lot of the time. I do read some fiction, but I also like to get out on the water. We are so close to the ocean in Nova Scotia. As in Maine, I know people are often so close to the ocean. So I can drive to a beach in 5 minutes and just to go down there and just relax. We have a little motorboat down about half an hour away from here. So, as much as we can during the months that allow it, we get out in the water. Just off the village where, my parents had their cottage in Chester. There's 365 islands. So our goal is to visit each one, and walk around it and explore it. So that's something we've been doing for the past 25 years. So that honestly, getting out in the water is probably my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's amazing what just like taking that little moment to go out, get on to, even if the island is within half a mile of, the coast, it's this whole new world that you get to explore. And it feels like
I love it.
Your own little private
and
space.
Most of them are uninhabited. So there's just, it's just you on an island and it's incredible. But I mean, we also have a million amazing hiking trails here. So we do also do a lot of hiking, which is super fun. But getting to an island, like you said, it's its own little space.
Yeah, no, that's great. What is your favorite smell and your least favorite smell in the garden?
Yeah. I do like the smell of manure. I know it makes me weird and my kids think it's kind of crazy, but I do love the smell of manure. But I also,
composted, right?
Of course. Well,
okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
mostly composted. Yeah, but composted.
Okay.
And I do love the smell, of course, of fresh basil. I mean, can you pass by a basil plant without ruffling its leaves and sticking your head in the middle of it? I don't think so. And lavender. So there's so many great smells. And when around my large vegetable garden a couple of years ago, it was just a terrible, ugly lawn. So we took it out and I replaced it with a lot of native perennials, native, shrubs, some fruiting plants and shrubs, and some antique roses. So we have a local grower in the Maritime Provinces that does own root antique roses. So I bought like 4 from him and immediately they grew and became huge plants. And so for about 8 weeks of the summer, I have a procession of antique roses that bloom and it is heavenly.
Oh, that's great. And what about your least favorite though?
Oh no. Do I have a least favorite smell in the garden? I don't think so. I mean, I even love cilantro. I love people's own. I guess I'd have to think about it. I love the smell of onions and garlic. I don't know. What's your least favorite smell in the garden?
It's a tie between rotting brassicas and rotting onions.
Rotting brassicas, you just nailed it. Yep, there you go. I kind of forgot about that, but then in spring, when you go and pull out the winter ones and then you get the mush on the stem and you're like, oh, All right, there you go.
Okay.
Rotten potatoes are pretty bad too.
Yep. Yeah, maybe it's a tie between all three. Yep.
100%.
What do you love besides farming?
Again, I love being outside. I love being, whether it's hiking or walking or biking, which, I mean, I'm not an amazing biker, but I like to do it. I'm not going long distances, but there's a lot of trails up in the Annapolis Valley where we have so many market gardeners here in the province. And they go along the Bay of Fundy where the tide rises like 25 feet between high and low tide. It's the highest tides in the world. And to bike along there in the trails and see that ocean, it's just incredible. So, if I'm not, growing food, then I'm probably going to be outside near the water or on the water.
Yeah.
Or in the water.
What would you be doing if you weren't gardening, writing, podcasting, teaching? I mean, I'll list all the other things that you do because you obviously have a plethora of things. What would you be doing if you weren't doing all those things?
It's hard to know, but I think I would have been a teacher. I love kids. I love teaching. I love sharing that. So I think that is probably what I would have done. Maybe high school teacher. I did think a couple of years ago, go back and get my teaching degree and go to teach high school. But yeah, I never did. I didn't have the time, honestly, but it would have been fun.
Yeah. No, that's great. What is your learning edge, or where do you feel like your abilities or understanding as a grower could grow?
Yeah, I think as gardeners, we all know there's always learning edges. There's always so much more to learn. I mean, I could study carrots my whole life and still not know very much about carrots. There's always so much more to learn, especially as the climate is changing. We have to learn to adapt to that. So I think that's what I'm working on right now. These temperature fluctuations we talked about earlier, trying to learn to adapt to that more. Always seeking out more resilient varieties and such like that as well. So I think I know there's always so much more to learn. So I'm trying to learn to deal with those different temperatures and what I need to do with my structures and my garden to make them more resilient, in terms of that changing climate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. Where and how does wildness enter or influence your gardening practice?
Yeah, so I do have a lot of self-seeders, self-sowers as well. But for the most part, the wildness is every other part of my property. My front yard, which is a nice hill, and it's always been the sledding hill, which is why it's not under cultivation, is mostly clover. I plant that for the bees and the deer and lots of other critters like the rabbits. And then, the backyard around the whole garden, as I mentioned, I took out the terrible weedy lawn and I replaced it with a lot of native plants. So I have giant stands of swamp milkweed, which is our only native milkweed in Nova Scotia, as well as a parade of blooms from very, very early in the season, the earliest bulbs in March, all the way until the very late asters, the New England asters finish up in usually November. There's always something in bloom. And doing that just 3 years ago has changed my garden so much in terms, like even the vegetable garden, in terms of the diversity of birds and insects and pollinators that I now see. For the first time ever, like for the past 2 years, the monarchs that visit my yard. I mean, I would see a monarch, a couple in the summer here and there, but now I have dozens at a time in my yard and garden. And, I was able to, I feel like the monarch mama, but I raised like several dozen last year on my milkweed plants in the garden. And yeah, so it has made a tremendous difference in the garden, and it's made it even more interesting to me. It's made it healthier, and introduced so many other species, which I'm trying to learn about because some of them are new to me, some of the birds and such as well. And I'm trying to learn more about them so I can, plant more things that they'll like and entice them for longer periods of time.
Yeah, no, that's great. And last question, how will you grow old gardening?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will. I already know the next iteration of my garden. We have a little piece of land near the ocean that we hopefully will build on in the next couple of years. And I will build a smaller raised bed garden there. And I will have a polytunnel like the one I have now, probably about the same size. And, I want it to be manageable, which is why I'll stick to raised beds. And, the plants that I choose in terms of the landscape will be a lot of native plants and shrubs and trees. We have so many red oaks, which is our only native oak in the province on our land. I want to encourage those red oaks because they're just so incredibly important to so many species of moths and insects and birds and so many other types of creatures. So I think I'll downsize the food part of it, although it'll be bigger than probably the average garden. But I will also encourage more wildness, I think, as I grow older.
Oh, I love that. Well, good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Niki. It's been a pleasure talking with you. You really are a wealth of so much knowledge, and I hope listeners are excited to take in all that you've shared and you probably have to listen to this episode numerous times.
I talk so fast.
Well, no, but you pack in so much information and it's great. So
thank you. And thank you for, Four Seasons Farms being such an influence to so many, people over the decades and helping everybody develop skills like this so that they can enjoy a year-round harvest. It's certainly saving me money on groceries and reducing our food bills. And I know it influences so many other people too. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks again for being here and happy upcoming spring to you up in Nova Scotia. So thank you so much.
Thank you.